Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I'm going to be doing a review of How Do You Live by Genzaburo Yoshino. This is just going to be a quick review. This is a book that I was debating actually not even doing a review about it, but I just absolutely fell in love with this book and I wanted to recommend it to you folks because I think it's so underrated. I've not heard anybody talk about it, and I think if you're somebody who is interested in not necessarily Japanese literature, but if you're just interested in like life and thinking about life and why we do the things that we do and like finding your purpose, then I think this is a book that will deeply resonate with you. I picked up How Do You Live because a friend of mine recommended it to me. I went to the bookstore, she works there, and she said you should read this because this actually influenced the most recent Studio Ghibli film, The Boy and the Heron. It is a semi-autobiographical movie about Hayao Miyazaki's childhood, and he also took inspiration from this book, How Do You Live? I think when this book was first published, it was back in like the 1930s or might have been like the 1940s. It was seen as a piece of rebellious fiction in Japan because there's a lot of exploration around kind of like Western ideology. I think at that point in Japan, there was a lot of like Christian ideology in government and politics, and a lot of the themes and topics discussed in this book, whilst I don't think they're necessarily anti-Christian or anti-religion in any way, a lot of them are very like scientific, there was the perception that they were very anti-Christian, at least at the time. So it was seen as being quite forward-thinking at the time that it was published, and I can see why. And from what I read, the book is very much targeted at children, and it was about helping children understand kind of ideas that were of more of a free and progressive nature than what was being discussed at the time, which there was a lot of like Japanese militarism in the 1930s. Now, the author himself actually at one point talked about how this book wasn't even intended to be like a literary work, but it was actually intended to be a book on ethics. And I think when you look at it through that lens, you start to unravel certain things about this book in a way that maybe you wouldn't if you just looked at it purely from a literary perspective. And I thought that was really interesting because there are so many things discussed in this book that definitely lends itself to that sort of ethical discussion. And I think with that in mind, I wanted to give a little bit of extra context. Let's go into what this book is about and then my thoughts on it. So this book, we are following our main hero, and he is a child who goes by the name of Copper. And we also follow another character who is his uncle. And they are essentially act as like our partners in understanding science, ethics, and also like how to think. They basically ask questions and they ponder about life through events that happen in their own lives. And it's just a really beautiful like meditation on what life is about and why humans do the things that they do. And if you've been watching my channel for even a remote while, you know these are things that I love in my books, and these are things that I think about actively myself every single day. So when I read this book, it just felt like I was reading a book that was written for me. Now, when I was reading this book, I was messaging my patrons. I remember writing in our Discord that this book was written for me. This book was written for 8, 9, 10-year-old Zara, but it was also written for adult Zara as well, because we get the child's perspective throughout the entirety of the book, but we also get the uncle's perspective, who I think is in his 30s. We get his perspective throughout the majority of the book as well. So we're seeing the child's reflection on life, but we're also seeing the uncle's reflection on life. In a weird way, I'm almost like a mishmash of the two. And it just felt very magical to read because I felt like I was seeing myself again through a younger lens. I've just jumped into what I liked about it, I just realised, but I'm not going to say more about what this book is about because it would spoil it. And I think this is one of these books that you should go into it with zero expectation whatsoever, because you will be pleasantly surprised at the questions it brings up and the discussions that it brings up. And it does it in a way that feels very organic and feels very natural to the characters in this book. And you can't help but think about your own perspective and your own views on these different topics that are discussed. And it's just absolutely magical. Now, this is obviously a translated piece of fiction, so, you never know kind of how close to the original it is, but I think it does a really beautiful job of conveying the main themes across. I think Yoshino has a really beautiful way with words, and I'm definitely curious to read more of his other stuff, but unfortunately a lot of that is not translated into English, so I better get on with my Japanese learning so I can read them in Japanese. But I think there's a lot of discussion around kind of science and philosophy and morality, and also just more like relatable topics such as privilege and like being able to go to a good school and being able to have things that other people don't have. Also, there's a lot of exploration around productivity in society, about how when products are made, there's a whole line of people who work to make that thing happen. I mean, the phone that I'm recording this on, me purchasing it was the end part of that process. There's been people, probably hundreds of people, thousands of people who've been involved in some way, shape or form to get this iPhone into my hands. And there's a lot of exploration around that, which I just really liked. And again, it's not something that I've thought about recently, but it's something that I've thought about in the past. And it was really nice to be reminded that the value of an object isn't necessarily just the price that we pay for it. It's also the effort that goes into making that thing happen. And I just thought that was really interesting. So anyway, my review of this isn't typical to what my normal reviews are like, because there's no plot to this book. There's no real sense of, there's no overarching thing that this book is trying to achieve. It's just a book about life. Like, that's really what it's about, and it's really incredible. One of the other things that I really loved about this book is I love the way that the book is written. We meet the child, Copper, and his uncle, both right at the start of the book. And the book is told in a way where Copper will reflect on something, and then the uncle will write a letter to Copper in response to a discussion that they've had in the past, whether it was in person or Copper has told him retrospectively in like a letter or something. So we actually get a lot of reflection from the uncle, but it's done in a way that just feels extremely personal and extremely intimate, and it's just absolutely beautiful to read. And it's something that I actually want to start doing myself. Like, I think it's one of those things where you don't necessarily need to do it for the purpose of sending it to someone. I just think if you have an interesting conversation to someone and it lingers in your mind, you could write a letter to just reflect on what has been discussed. I just think it's such a beautiful idea, and it's something that I'm going to try. And this is another thing that I loved about this book, is that this is the sort of book that makes me want to write. Like, there's very few books that I read that actively make me want to write a book myself. But this is one of those extremely rare instances where I read it and I was like, oh man, I really want to write now. I just want to write about this book. I want to write about the things that are bubbling away in my head 24/7. And, I've definitely started writing a little bit, nothing crazy, and I don't ever necessarily intend to show that to anybody. But the process of writing itself is just such a beautiful idea, in the sense that I find that a lot of people just these days don't write physically in a book, and it brought up that idea to me as well, which is obviously not a novel idea, it's not a new idea, but I think ideas are best written down, because then you can truly get to the root of what it is you're trying to ponder or question, and I found that in the past for myself as well. Anyway, that was a little bit of a diversion. I thought the best way to actually get across how beautiful this book was to actually read some passages from the book. So let's try and find one. This is a passage written by the uncle in a letter. It's quite long, but again, I think it will go to show you how beautiful this book is. You know that water comes from oxygen and hydrogen, don't you? And you're aware that in water, these are in a ratio of 1:2. This sort of thing can be fully explained in words, and what's more, you can watch an experiment in class and say to yourself, aha, I see how it works. But when it comes to the taste of cold water, there's no way to teach that other than letting you drink the water yourself. No matter how anyone tries to explain, you're not going to understand the actual taste unless you have that experience. In the same way, there's no way to explain the colour red to anyone who hasn't seen it with their own living eyes, because it's something a person starts to understand only when the colour red meets their eyes in reality. There are lots of things like this in life. For example, a person discovers the pleasure of painting, sculpture, and music only by experiencing them. You will never be able to make someone understand this if they have not encountered great art. And for this subject in particular, we need more than our ordinary eyes and ears. To appreciate art, you must use your inner eyes and ears. You must open your heart. And your heart, well, it only opens when you actually encounter a great work of art in person, and it makes a deep impression on you. If it means anything at all to live in this world, it's that you must live your life like a true human being and feel just what you feel. This is not something that anyone can teach from the sidelines, no matter how great a person they may be. Oh, it's just so beautiful. It's so poetic, and this book is littered with things like that. And it might seem a bit surface level to some people, but I think when you really just sit there and you let this book kind of wash over you, it takes you on a journey that is truly, really beautiful and makes you realise, in a way, how lucky we are to be able to experience the things that we have in our life. Things like culture, art, reading books, listening to music, going to the cinema, watching movies, playing video games, like the things that, there's things that we all have to do in life, right? We have to pay the bills, blah, blah, blah. But there are things that enrich your life, right? And those are the experiences that you have when you experience things like art, or when you discover the wonders of the world through science. And I think this book really is just like a love letter to art and science, and a kind of philosophical treatise to ensuring that we ask the right questions, even though we might not necessarily have those answers. Absolutely stunning. I'm going to read one more. So there's one bit where Copper talks about a schoolboy in his class who comes from poverty. And this brings on a whole discussion around like honour and how, obviously people who have money are naturally in, or I should say disposable income, have the privilege of being able to go to the best schools, private schools, all of that. How in many ways that's obviously where most people would like to be, but it also talks more importantly, I think, about the people who don't necessarily have those opportunities and how they view their life. I'm going to read a bunch about that. So here we go. Copper, as you take your way toward adulthood, you will eventually come to understand that to lead a life of poverty is often to go about one's life feeling inferior to others. It's easy to catch oneself feeling ashamed of one's shabby clothes, squalid home, or coarse food. Of course, there are also magnificent people who take rightful pride in themselves as they live their lives, despite the fact that they are poor. But many in this world seem to lose their self-respect in the presence of the wealthy, and instead bow and scrape blindly as if they wonder whether they are complete equals. These people, of course, deserve contempt, not because they have no money, it's because their servile nature allows no alternative. But Copper, even those who have all due self-respect may feel small at times if they're living in poverty. It's an inevitable part of human nature, and we don't want to cause needless embarrassment to people, so we must not forget to make a habit of modesty and restraint in our lives. Human beings should never be so humiliated as to damage their self-respect. But people who live in poverty are often forced to endure such indignities, so we must remember that their pride can be easily wounded. So in theory, then saying that someone is poor shouldn't make them feel small. It should go without saying that the true worth of a person doesn't depend on that person's clothes or house or food. No matter what kind of magnificent garments they wear or grand mansion they inhabit, fools are fools, bores are boorish, and their value as people shouldn't be elevated for those reasons. Furthermore, if someone has a noble mind and great insight, then we owe it to them to respect them as great, even if they are impoverished. Therefore, someone with true confidence in their value as a human being should be able to live unaffected, even if their circumstances shift a bit this way or that. You and I too, because we are human, must live with only our value as human beings in mind, not thinking we are unimportant if we happen to be poor, or that we are great because we lead a wealthy life. Someone who feels inferior because they are poor can never be much of a human being. And that's the last one that I'm going to quote, because otherwise I'm just going to end up quoting the whole book. But again, it goes to show you the layers of thinking in this book that I just think are really, really beautifully captured. There are many discussions like this, and there are many different topics that they explore that all relate to each other in one way or another, just because, this is ultimately a book about life and how one should live their life and how one should go about approaching their life. So I've just realised the two examples that I gave were from the uncle's perspective, but the uncle is responding to Copper's thoughts. So we are getting Copper's thoughts first, and then the uncle responds in the letter. So a lot of the discussion points come from Copper, and it's about him reflecting on things that he sees. Like, one of the first things he talks about is how humans are like atoms and how we attract to each other, how we repel each other. And that brings on a whole discussion. And Copper is obviously a very intelligent young boy. He's able to pick up on cues that most adults probably wouldn't be able to pick up on. He's very observant and really feels life and really feels people around him. And because of that, he's able to understand human nature in a way, like I said, that most people probably wouldn't be able to, even when they're an adult. I think this is something that I just loved about this book, is that, just speaking for myself, Copper, as I mentioned at the start, I really identify with him from when I was a child, and I really then identify with the uncle as an adult. So it's kind of like the perfect book for me in a way, because, as I've mentioned many times, I love philosophy in my books, and I love like the question of like why people do things and how we should aim to be better and things like that. And also just like the origins of knowledge as well. Like, it's something that I'm super interested in. And then finding both characters relatable but in different ways, it was just the perfect book for me. Like, and when I read it as well, I was just in awe of the themes it discusses. And I think especially when you look at it through the context of this being a children's book, it just makes it that much more magical, in my opinion. So I think this book is definitely like a warm hug. I think if you're, you know, going through a particularly difficult time, or if you want your eyes to be opened up a little bit, I think this is the perfect book to read. I gave this book a full 0.75 stars, and the only reason why I didn't give it a full 5 stars, which I will probably change, is because the uncle's letters stop towards the end of the book, and I didn't like that. I did really enjoy the uncle's bits. I just wish they'd kept going up until the end of the book. I don't know why the author decided not to have him reflect right up until the end. I don't know what the creative decision was behind that. But I noticed when he stopped writing, and I just would have loved it right up until the end. But that was my only critique. I loved it. I think if any of this resonated, if any of this sounds like something you would enjoy, you should definitely pick it up. It's quite a short book. I read it in a day, less than a day. And it's definitely going to be a book that I pick up again, because it's truly, truly beautiful. So there we have it. I hope you liked this review. If you did, please do give it a thumbs up. I've been reading quite a bit of Japanese translated fiction recently and been having a ball. I am definitely going to be reading more, and I will be doing more reviews and recommendation videos as always. If there's any books that you particularly recommend that are Japanese translated especially, do let me know down below, and I will definitely consider checking them out. Thank you everybody, take care, and I'll see you in my next video. Mata ne!